Hi, my name is Ralph Strickland, and I'm a student in Mr. Gudak's class, which is the criminal law class, Criminal Justice 131. Today I'm going to talk about the crime of involuntary manslaughter in the state of North Carolina. I chose this because there are several important distinctions, several elements of the crime that have to be demonstrated in order to prove this, and I think it's important to understand how this works so that you can distinguish this from other forms of homicide. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into this. Here we can see how they define involuntary manslaughter in North Carolina according to the general statutes. So in North Carolina, this is a Class F felony, all right? It's defined by North Carolina General Statute 14-18, and it is a homicide. A homicide is defined as killing of another person, but there are important distinctions that have to be made between different types of homicides regarding how they're punished, how they're prosecuted. So first we'll talk about murder. Murder is obviously the most serious kind of homicide, and murder is the killing of another person in a deliberate, willful, or premeditated manner. All right, here in North Carolina, we have various degrees of murder, first-degree murder and second-degree murder. It is the most serious felony in the state of North Carolina. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it other than to distinguish it from other types of homicides. Next, you have voluntary manslaughter. Voluntary manslaughter is killing of another person, but without malice or premeditation. And here, the state must prove that the defendant committed an intentional and unlawful act that is likely to cause death or great bodily harm. Now, I use the North Carolina School of Government's webpage for this, and they had a pretty good summation of how all these different types of homicide work. All right, so the example they gave, and they gave the case of State versus English, was a man or woman, it didn't distinguish, but a married person caught their spouse in the act of cheating and killed them. All right, and this was, like I said, State versus English. It sounds more like a murder to me, but they were charged with voluntary manslaughter in that case. Next, you have involuntary manslaughter. And involuntary manslaughter is the unlawful killing of a person without malice, without premeditation or deliberation, and without the intent to kill or inflict serious bodily injury. So the example they give for this would be, let's say you got into a fist fight with another person, right? Now you can't use a weapon. That's a factor that would move it away from involuntary manslaughter to maybe voluntary manslaughter. But if you got into a fight with another person and you hit them with your fist, and either that caused their death or maybe they fell and hit their head and that caused their death. In either case, you would probably be charged with involuntary manslaughter, and the reference case for that was State versus Gamola, which was in 2018. So let's talk a little bit about the elements of the crime. All right. In order for a prosecutor to prove involuntary manslaughter, they have to demonstrate these various elements of the crime. Okay. First, it must be proved that the defendant's actions were the proximate cause of death due to either an unlawful act not amounting to a felony, nor naturally dangerous to human life, or a culpably negligent act or omission, such as the intentional, willful, or wanton violation of a statute or ordinance designed to protect human life or limb. And they have a pretty good example of this I'm going to talk about in a minute. The first example I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to spend much time on because I didn't research it. The other one is relatively close to us here in the western part of the state. I thought it was also a fairly interesting case, so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about it. But one example they gave was if you assisted or encouraged a young person, say somebody that was under legal drinking age, in this case 19, to possess and consume an amount of alcohol that caused their death. And this was the 2013 case of State versus Noble. The case that I am going to talk about, which is State versus Fisher, involved depositing a victim in an isolated area in an injured, intoxicated, and underclothed condition on a very closed night. But I'll get into that, like I say, a little bit more in a minute. I have a lot more detail. So what you can see here are the sentencing ranges for the Class F felonies in North Carolina. I highlighted the mitigated first offense range. You would be sentenced to 10 to 13 months in that case. And then that's for a first offense. And then if you had multiple offenses and you'd accumulated a certain number of points, and again, we'd have to get into how that would work in our criminal justice system, you could be sentenced anywhere between 33 and 41 months. Now, I'll point out to you this 19 to 23 month range because that's what Mr. Fisher got in the case that I'm going to talk about in a minute. That seems to indicate that it wasn't his first offense and that there were aggravating factors present. All right, so I'm going to play a video here in just a second. What you can see here on this slide is Mr. Fisher. The important things that I want to mention with regards to this case is that this was heard before the appellate court in 2013. At the time, North Carolina Attorney General, but current Governor Roy Cooper argued the case, and Mr. Fisher here, you can see in the picture, was appealing his sentence of a term of 19 to 23 months imprisonment based on his conviction for involuntary manslaughter. So I'm going to play a news report from WLOS, which discusses this. It doesn't go into a lot of detail. I'll go into more detail in a minute, but this is slightly before he was convicted. It's during his trial.
A man on trial for the death of a mountain teenager could learn his fate tomorrow.
A Henderson County jury resumes deliberations in the morning to decide if Scott Fisher is guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Now, he was charged almost 1 year after 16-year-old Michael Rogers was found dead in a hog field.
News 13's Megan Shearing has our continuing coverage. Megan, this seems to be moving really quick.
It does, Larry. It's only taken 4 days to try this case, but for Michael Rogers' family, it feels like an eternity. They hope the jury reaches a decision soon.
All rise. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. This Honorable Court for the County of Henderson now stands in recess till the hour of 9:30 in the morning.
As court dismisses for the day, Scott Fisher's future is still on hold. The 21-year-old is facing involuntary manslaughter charges for the death of 16-year-old Michael Rogers. Late Thursday afternoon, jurors heard closing arguments, then began deliberations. And after an hour and a half with no verdict, the judge sent them home.
I was hoping that it would come back soon, but you know, I've waited for a while. This is about to close, so I'm hopeful that it will be guilty.
For more than 2 years now, Barbara Leonard has been seeking justice for her son Michael. His body was discovered in a field after a party at Scott Fisher's house. An autopsy shows the 16-year-old died from hypothermia and that he had been beaten. Leonard says when Fisher took the stand today, she had to relive her son's last night alive.
He said that it was another gentleman that fought with my son, and he said that he had caught in a fight with him as well. And he said that they had took him, instead of taking him to the church, they took him to the river access and left him.
She wants the jury to find Fisher guilty, but says if they do, an involuntary manslaughter conviction won't be enough. Now, Scott Fisher's family did not want to talk to the media today. The jury will continue deliberations tomorrow morning.
So there's several important things that I think you need to understand to see how the state went about making this case. All right. What happened was that in 2010, 16-year-old Michael Scott Rogers attended a party at a residence near where his parents lived in Henderson County. Now, this was very close to the Henderson and Transylvania County lines, and that gets important because it became a jurisdictional issue. They first, I think, called the Transylvania County Sheriff's Department, and they went to search, and then they couldn't find them. And although they could, of course, cross county lines, they had to coordinate with Henderson County, and that probably led to a delay in finding him. Around 11 o'clock, young Mr. Rogers made 2 calls to his mother. In the first call, his mother reports that his speech was slurred, but that he asked for her and his stepfather to come and pick him up. When he called back a few minutes later, he was crying. And when his mother asked him where he was, he said, quote, "I don't know. They done beat the hell out of me. I'm laying here and I'm bleeding all over, and I just pray to God they don't come back and kill me." And I think that may be the aggravating factor, was that he was assaulted. Whether he was assaulted by Mr. Fisher, that was a fact that his mother mentioned there. Apparently he was assaulted by somebody else. The evidence of that assault was present on his body when he was found, and so those factors contributed probably to that aggravated sentencing. His mother received the information and learned where he was supposed to be, so they arranged to go to pick him up, and they said that was at Blantyre Baptist Church. I don't really know where this is. I'm not familiar with that part of Henderson County. But that apparently is located on Kings Road, a short distance from the site of the party. The night when this occurred, the temperatures were in the 20s, so very cold, and Miss Leonard and her husband arrived at the scene where they had agreed to pick him up at that church, Blantyre Baptist Church, but he wasn't there. So they started trying to make calls to figure out what was wrong, but nobody seemed to have any idea of where he was. Apparently, later, when questioned by police, Mr. Fisher said that when the party broke up, he gave Mr. Rogers a ride to the intersection of Highway 64 and Kings Road and dropped him off there. And apparently, Mr. Rogers then wandered off somewhere and froze to death. His body was found nearby. As I said, he was convicted. He received a sentence of 19 to 23 months, which he appealed, but the conviction was upheld. So if anybody has any questions about that, I'll do what I can to argue it, or excuse me, to answer it. I don't really know many of the specifics of the case other than what I've explained so far. Here are some of the references I talked about. The case text was really good for letting me see the details of this case. And then, as I mentioned, the North Carolina School of Government had a very good website for explaining this. I always use this last one because that's where I got the sentence ranges coming from. And this concludes my presentation.